Oda literally raised the roof in 1079, but it's not something we shouldn't have seen or understood. In fact, he told us the outcome of this event way ahead of time, and I want to speak upon that. I think chapter 1079 should be akin to chapter 1044. These are chapters that are meant to give us a glimpse of the future of One Piece, the future that many viewers and consumers of One Piece either don't see or can't even comprehend. And I've used the phrase beyond our imagination several times in my videos in the past to allude to this probable future. But now more than ever, the future is here, and it's coming quickly, so let me help you connect to it before it catches you off guard. The way I view the world is by making connections. So let me connect you to my vision, the ParVision. So I said that Oda told us ahead of time that Shanks would imaginary diff Kid in 1079, despite everyone on all sides failing to properly calculate the extent of Shanks' power that he displayed. I mean, off of chapter 1076, one of my major takeaways was this, right? We've seen Law on his ship. We've seen Law in his sauce. We've seen Law in the water. I don't think we've seen Kid on his ship. We don't know what, maybe he has something special on his ship. Kid finally is like, you know what? I'm gonna pull out the railgun. Or on his ship, he has something crazier. He could wipe out the fleet that's in front of him, like however many ships there are. And that could be terrifying, right? That could be like, oh, damn, I didn't think he could just like wipe out like actual Shanks' fleet. Like that, hey, that's a W. I give that a W, right? But like, I don't know how far that W goes in terms of Shanks' part. And I don't know where the climax would be. And I thought this is what was going to happen, but I couldn't comprehend the aftermath, and now we know why. The depths of Shanks' anger and how much power was behind that one popped vein was incalculable. I mean, we didn't even see this of Shanks when he stopped Akainu, but we did see a version of this. In fact, we saw 2 popped veins from Shanks when he was deterring Admiral Ryokugu. Now obviously I'm not using the veins as a legitimate power scaling benchmark, but I do think that Oda was displaying something here. I mean, the feat in chapter 1055 was a ridiculous one, that probably comes from a similar anger that Shanks felt in 1079. But at chapter 1055, when Shanks showed up to Wano, we should have understood that Shanks was beyond everything we currently know. If we take into account where Shanks was, he was outside of the inner seas of Wano, which are already vast. Then the land of Wano itself is massive. Many people have scaled Wano to be double the size of India. And while those scales might not appeal to you, in the story we have a line that says, in Wano, in order to deliver the news, they shot arrows from the central point of Wano, and this line here translates to over 1,000 miles. Meaning from the center of Wano to the other regions is about this far. And while speaking to several people more familiar with the language, this could be seen as a hyperbole, as it was officially translated as great distances, but fairly understood that it'd be fair to say something closer to at least like 100 miles. And so you can reasonably understand that Shanks has an observation hockey range that seems to casually be larger than Enel's realm of perception, whose perception was boosted by his lightning fruit. And on top of that, in this scene, Shanks also used his Conqueror's Haki to essentially send a very strong message to an admiral that was enough to deter him. Now, a lot of people have taken this portrayal of Aramaki on Wano as a way to denounce his strength and stature as a combatant, but he is still an admiral and should be regarded with a higher power perspective, and especially with 1079 in perspective, Aramaki backing down immediately makes sense. I mean, if you put the 1079 Shanks feat into perspective, he literally could have flew to Wano and shown up right next to the admiral if he wanted to. Aramaki did not mess around, put his hands up almost immediately, showing he understood how insanely powerful Shanks was. And like we should view chapter 1079 and chapter 1055, we shouldn't use these scenes to lower the characters on the receiving end of Shanks' anger, but instead we should use these moments to understand how much further Shanks is from everyone else. Shanks in these scenes demonstrated a power gap that should be respected, and what's really interesting was I pointed out this line when it was released and not many people really viewed it the same way I did, but I think now it makes a lot more sense, and King of Lightning agrees. Shanks calls Luffy and the other primary pirates on Wano new shoots, or as TCB translated it, as saplings, or as Artur told me, new leaves, which sounds so interesting because that is still an early stage of a flowering plant. For Shanks to describe the new era to still be new shoots or saplings saplings after they just unrooted 2 major Yonkos that have spent literally decades planting themselves and strengthening their stranglehold over the world. And the reason why this line stood out to me was because it was a direct parallel to what Rayleigh said of the Strahds back on Sabaody when Kizaru was attacking them. To paint the parallel, a former Roger pirate came to the aid of the New Era, standing against an admiral in the efforts to allow the New Era to grow. And Rayleigh says in chapter 511, "Don't pick the buds before they sprout. Their era is only just beginning." And if you were to take this line and understand Rayleigh's role for a second, you can see how this is a reflection of power. Rayleigh and Shanks are playing a gardener role here, and small plants need the extra care and nourishment. And going into Sabaody, we got several times of how much of a distance there was between Rayleigh and the worst generation. For example, in chapter 498, Shaki, who we now know to be an ex-empress of Amazon Lily, gave us an interesting estimate that Rayleigh was about 100 times stronger than Sabaody Luffy. Then when Rayleigh actually shows up at the auction house and he uses his haki, which was largely unknown to all the pirates present, and thereafter countering Kizaru for the Straw Hats, he was demonstrating the exact upgrades that Luffy specifically needed to attain to close that 100 multiplier gap that Shaki explained. I think all of this is the exact same role that Shanks played in chapter 1055 and then demonstrated to us in chapter 1079. Shanks showed up protecting the New Era just like Rayleigh and updates the progress report saying that Luffy and the rest are now new shoots, new leaves, or my favorite, saplings. We didn't get a multiplier estimate like we did from Shaki previously, but no, we got something way better, a direct display of the difference, the gap between a 3 billion bounty pirate and Shanks. And that's why I said Oda already prepared us with that line. Him calling Kid a sapling, and even Luffy respectfully here, should have really created this expectation no matter how ridiculous it felt. They aren't even plants yet. They still need guidance. And most importantly, just like how the powers that Rayleigh demonstrated to us while being introduced were what Luffy and his crew needed, I believe that Shanks set the new vision, the new goal. Both chapters 1055 and 1079 with Wi-Fi Haki and basically Superman Goku are where we need to see Luffy at before Luffy even takes on the final arcs. Something we have to remember is that Shanks is this awkward soul in between two eras. But when Rayleigh says the new era should be created by people who live in the present, I think Shanks should be allowed to partake in it. Something is holding him back, or maybe more accurately, something is pulling him forward. Clearly, he is extremely strong and powerful, but why can't he create the change he wants to see? Why does he need the new era to do it? And for that, let's take a better look at what Shanks actually showed us in these demonstrations. Let's put this in perspective first, which is that whatever we seen of Shanks just now was only the appetizers. In no way do I think any of what we saw is even a fraction of what Shanks has within his bag. And I think that's super important to understand. I remember a time when we thought Kaido had an endless bag of tricks, and his introduction was not even as close to being this versatile. Shanks, through some combination of observation haki and Conqueror's haki, sent a signal to Aramaki to deter him and make him shake and honestly hurt him. This blast of Conqueror's haki also imparted an image in Luffy's mind about who it was, which is an interesting addition to that power that Shanks showed. Then in 1079, Shanks literally flew like a bullet, and I'm not a pixel scaler by any means, but the distance and time it took him to get there, it's almost like he was light itself here. And he finished it off with a simple divine departure that was strong enough that the splash damage incapacitated Killer, a Onigashima rooftop contender, and the haki blast completely took out the rest of the crew. It's honestly kind of impressive that Heat and Wire withstood this amount of Conqueror's haki, which is probably the only demerit on Shanks' record here. But maybe that was intentional. I mean, Shanks needed to keep someone awake to hand him the poneglyph rubbings, right? But anyways, the point is, Shanks literally opened the door into the last saga. Shanks is the window that Oda wants to take us through for the end of One Piece, which is so fitting because Shanks is technically the one who inspired our pirate journey ever since chapter 1. Since then, Luffy's goal was to surpass Shanks, but also there will be a variety of characters that would lead up to Shanks' level, and several other characters that breach this and shock the fandom. Most characters that have been hidden until now probably are of this tier, are close, or surprisingly above this benchmark. Choose wisely who you think is where on this spectrum of power, because it'll break a lot of agendas. But I'm of the opinion that if or when Kaido or Big Mom re-enter the story, they will be upscaled to this level, if not higher. And while that is an anime trope, I think there is an in-story reasoning for why they would randomly become super strong again. But that discussion is for a video topic with a different focus. What I want to focus on are things that Shanks demonstrated and why it's so significant, but also why it was predicted on this channel and why that's important to understand the ending of the last saga. This will also contain some details from Film Red that are canon to the manga. So let's get started. Something I'll expand on at a later time is the pattern of how Oda introduces us to power. For example, Doflamingo was introduced as a character who is all-encompassing, controlling, manipulating, and most importantly, knowledgeable of the world and how power worked. So understandably, as we left the Dressrosa arc, Doflamingo showed us the ceiling of power at the time, which was an awakening that allowed him to use his power to literally control the environment and hinged on his understanding of his power. So on top of his versatility when it comes to power, but also environmental control from a soul standpoint, we go to Whole Cake Island, where Big Mom also demonstrates some insane levels of powers that truthfully Luffy did not tackle head on there. And there are still some question mark moments that I feel like can be explained later on. But obviously the main antagonist for Luffy in Whole Cake Island was Katakuri, who was introduced to us as a cool, calm, collected Banff type of persona, but emphasis on cool and calm because that ended up being the exact power up that our hot-headed main character Luffy needed to attain in order to start seeing into the future, which was the next ceiling achieved by this arc. Then the same thing happened with Kaido, where Kaido demonstrated an impressive ability that demonstrated why even someone like Big Mom regards him as a conqueror like no other. And the reason Kaido was able to do that was because somehow he could incorporate his conqueror's will within every attack, which means that, like the attack insinuates, his attacks literally conquer anyone who cannot imitate it. And then we see Luffy incorporate his own conqueror's will within his attacks, and thus raising the next ceiling of power, where even Zoro, a character we estimate to be a contender for the top echelons of the world, is also able to demonstrate it by the end of this arc. And so naturally we should expect that the next arcs will raise the ceiling even more and build off of the previous arcs. And with that, now we have Shanks. 1055 and 1079 are the introduction. And so again, let's put that into perspective. In chapter 1055, from a minimum of a few hundred miles away, Shanks shows the ability to sense people, individuals even, as we can understand from the fact that he was able to pinpoint his Conqueror's Haki lightning to perfectly hit Aramaki. Like every other antagonist before, we are being introduced to something new, but more similarly to Rayleigh's introduction to the Straw Hats, something completely foreign and unique. Yes, we know enough about Haki to understand what is happening, but do we? See, while most people created a new term to contextualize what happened here, naming it Wi-Fi Haki, my viewers and this channel had a name preset for it if it were to ever show up into the story, and that would be Mind Rope. This is still one of my favorite videos, and you might be wondering where I pulled that term from and why that's related to Observation Haki or this scene. But essentially, Observation Haki was introduced to us as mantra, and mantra actually translates to what I simplified to Mind Rope. And I would go watch that video to get a fuller understanding of it, but for the sake of time here, it's essentially the idea that there seems to be an importance of creating an empathy link with someone, something Luffy seems to do naturally and even Rayleigh emphasized when it came to Future Sight. And my interpretation was that in order for Future Sight to work really well, you have to understand your opponent. The better you can do that, the more effective Future Sight will be, and we saw that as Luffy grew in Future Sight during his fight with Katakuri. They also grew in understanding of each other, which is why Katakuri conceded to Luffy and Luffy respected Katakuri by the end of it. And so while that is relevant here, the other things I said in that video was that Mind Rope would be a way for people to essentially telepathically communicate, similar to how Zunisha communicated to Momo or Viola transferred memories to Sanji. Thereafter, we saw Luffy and Momo do this during Onigashima, but in 1055, we saw that Aramaki was able to essentially understand Shanks' intentions and words, whether coincidentally or because that was Shanks' will being transferred through his Haki. But what's even crazier is that since Luffy knows Shanks, he was better able to sense Shanks and said that a face came to mind, which is literally what Zunisha Oda and Viola were able to do, and I said would happen in the future with Shanks, making a parallel to Key Sense from Dragon Ball, which plays an obvious influence for the One Piece story. And so I think that scene was an introduction to the ability to pinpoint on someone with mind rope. And what's super crazy was that a viewer, Juxtaplicity, brought something interesting to my attention in my live stream for 1079. It was that Shanks read about Kid's history, seemingly gaining an understanding of his rampaging nature prior to using his future sight to seeing Kid literally go on a rampage on his fleet. He was able to see into the future of Kid's action for a minimum of 10 seconds, but possibly even more, which is more than what Katakuri demonstrated. So Shanks in his introduction demonstrated an ability even beyond the end stage of Katakuri. But the overall point was that the reason why he was reading about Kid was so he could understand, learn, and thereafter see into Kid's future a little bit, and that came to use right after, which could be demonstrating an aspect of mind rope. And that might sound crazy, but if you had watched film Red, then you know in that movie Shanks treated Katakuri like a baby when it came to his future sight ability, which we know because of his canon information from Volume 4 Billion. For those of you who still don't know what that is, think of it as VIVER cards given to moviegoers in Japan prior to film Red theater experience. And so let me insert this prediction that I made in my mind rope video real quick that I had about Shanks. All agree that Shanks and his entire crew showing up at Marineford the way they did, unnoticed by literally everyone, is not a normal situation. Like the other iconic scene that we've seen of Shanks is him having such overwhelming presence that people literally could not ignore him walking on Whitebeard's ship. He seemed to do that intentionally to assert himself and prove himself to his old captain's rival, but if he had such profound control of his haki, it wouldn't be surprising if he could erase his presence too. It wasn't just Shanks either, his whole crew was a surprise. And on top of that, their entire boat showed up at Marineford despite being a whole sea away. It could be a single person on their crew has an ability that makes all of this possible, or maybe having several peak hockey users allows them to imitate devil fruit powers. And the reason why that is important is because on Shanks' Volume 4 Billion release, we see that Oda says that Shanks is known as the observation hockey killer, and ultimately through some means is able to prevent future sight and prevent people from sensing him, which we saw him essentially use when he entered the Gorosei's room. So while I don't think this is a power that is achieved through observation hockey, and rather it's through his insane conqueror's hockey, I think he is able to do it because of the mind rope concept. He is able to prevent someone from calmly sensing the future because of intimidation from his conquerors, but we've seen what happens when people are overwhelmed by conquerors. They just get knocked out. But what I'm saying is in between being knocked out and not being affected at all, there's probably a plethora of effects rooted in this ability, and one of them is preventing people who can see the future from accessing that power. When Katakuri said you had to be calm and Rayleigh mentioned Luffy's ability to be tuned into emotions, I think Shanks has a power of fear that he can instill to make someone emotionally unstable, thus weakening their haki. If you are resolved against that level of conquerors, then you will be fine, but there's probably not many who can get to that level. And to just explain another point of connection for the mind rope ability, it's slated in communication that actually Yasopp demonstrated with Usopp in film Red. So in my video, I was saying people who understand each other and have a synergy will be able to communicate telepathically. And while I didn't personally enjoy how they displayed it in the movie, Yasopp was able to communicate with Usopp and share each other's vision telepathically, but more than that, through separate dimensions, which might sound wild to you and so alien to One Piece, but I think now with Space Piece, but with Shanks also showing up in the way he has and Egghead reveals, it shouldn't surprise you. But the point I want to get across is while the events of film Red may not be canon, considering Oda clarified hockey feats prior to the movie and how moves from movies end up canon to the show, especially of the main characters, with one more thing on top, the director of the movie knows how One Piece ends. I wouldn't be surprised if these instances of crazy powers are windows into what the last saga holds, and that's ultimately the point I wanted to get to. This was Shanks' introduction, which already reaches to levels unheard of in One Piece when you break it down. It may just look like clashes on the panels, but there's a lot that's behind it. And that's where I want to reiterate. If this is what Shanks has shown us, then these are examples of what powers will look like towards the end of One Piece. Or at least the ceiling that Shanks will show us, not unlike the other antagonists of the past. But what's crazy is, we still haven't seen everything we know Shanks to be capable of within the manga itself. And there's actually two things that we haven't seen in the manga yet. The first one is obviously the observation hockey killer, which means we still don't have the means within the story to fully understand that, but the other part is in Volume 4 Billion, Oda said that Shanks is able to create a flame sword with no other explanation given, which if you heard me literally anywhere, you know I'm a huge supporter of the elemental hockey theory, where I've debated all the creators over it, including my combined probably 8 hours of streams with King of Lightning, and with Ragnar I debated with him at Jay's Reverie. But if you know my Sanji video, then you know I expanded on the elemental hockey theory by tying it to the emotions, and so the emotions that connect to fire we haven't seen yet from Shanks, despite how angry he got. But that is yet another ceiling that I think not only will Shanks raise for us, but also explain for us, which would be elemental hockey. And one thing that is for certain is that it seems like Shanks is a master of also blending hockey, which is what Kaido was saying Gear 5 Luffy was doing with armament and conquers. And I think Shanks will show us a lot of interesting things with observation hockey and everything else. Which, now bringing back the observation hockey killer aspect here, I think something important about observation hockey was if we are right about Shanks, Mind Rope, and what he did with Kid in chapter 1079, then I think Shanks' future sight is beyond 10 seconds. See, unlike elemental hockey, we actually have the upper limit of future sight, that if Shanks had, then it would explain so much about him, Mihawk, and Blackbeard. So if this future sight moment for Kid was the introduction, then we have Madame Charlie, who is able to see years into the future, several times. And what's even crazier is whatever the resource is on Laugh-Tale, it was able to convince Odin and foretell the events of Wano 800 years ahead of time, and 20 years before Odin's story ended, which would be future sight of some sort. These are 2 levels of insane future sight, but unlike the Void Century version, we see Madame Charlie, who can see these futures and is correct, but was so burdened by her power that she almost gave it up. She was afraid of the power almost in a hermit fashion, by shunning her own capabilities and also freaking out whenever she used it again. And you know what character has a similar vibe of having the capabilities but is cautiously adjacent to the storyline? Shanks. It might be that when Shanks gets to know a character, he can see their future and he suffers the burden of that. Which is why Shanks detaches and separates himself from what seems to be all of the people he loves. Which is why we see a reclusive hermit like Shanks chilling on a random island. This might even be how he chooses people for his fleet, but also be why he doesn't see them often. But if we were to look at a parallel of chapter 1071 and chapter 1, then the moment Shanks flew from Elbaf was the same as him flying from Fuchsia Village, which was something I brought up in the past. We still don't know how he got to Luffy, and it could make sense that if he had future sight there, he gave up his arm for some future way ahead of time. And similarly with Kid, after reading about his past, this was the path that Kid needed to grow beyond this, because surely with how strong Shanks was, when you're that much stronger, you don't need to kill somebody, which he didn't do. But also at the same time, if he wanted Kid dead, he could have just killed them, instead of having the Giants essentially reset the Kid pirate crew. But the reason why I think this future sight thing is inherent in Shanks is it would explain why Shanks acted the way he did with Whitebeard. When Shanks met Whitebeard, he said now is not the time to pit those two against each other, speaking about Ace and Blackbeard. No one will be able to stop this new era from spiraling into chaos. I wonder if Shanks saw from then the events of Marineford and why he showed up to then tell Kobe that his few seconds of courage will profoundly influence the fate of this world. Was that Shanks hinting at a future he saw and Kobe standing up in that moment changed it? If this is the power Shanks has, then this could explain some parts of what his conversation with Roger was after Roger came back from Laugh-Tale. It might have been confirming a future sight that Shanks saw, and that's what brought Shanks to tears. But more importantly, let's talk about this interaction with Blackbeard. See, I think the reason why Shanks and Mihawk is an interesting matchup is because Mihawk seems to have insane observation hockey as related to his epithet Hawkeyes and Clairvoyant, and just how calm he is. But if Shanks has observation hockey killing powers, then it might be a good counter to Mihawk, but at the same time, Mihawk could be strong enough to resist Shanks' power. And similarly, Shanks said his guard wasn't down against Blackbeard when Blackbeard gave him the scar on his eye. So what I think is if Shanks relies on future sight and observation hockey the way he did in 1079, it might make sense that Blackbeard has a power as well that confuses Shanks. It could be that Blackbeard might be able to show 3 futures or something like that, and so Shanks was caught off guard, and this would make sense because of what was said in 1079. Shanks said that he thought Blackbeard would be at Wano, but he didn't show up. So it might be that when it comes to fate, Blackbeard has a mysterious power that allows him to be unreadable for Shanks, which makes complete sense for his character. And all of that brings me back to Shanks' character, because ultimately I think the reason why Shanks is him, the reason why Shanks is a tier above every other character we have seen until now in the modern One Piece era, is because of one simple thing: resolve. The reason why I said Shanks is stronger than Kaido is because the Kaido we saw was a broken man. You cannot be resolved if you yourself are not a steadfast, stable character. We saw an interesting thing where Luffy said Kaido's haki was getting stronger while he was unstable and drunk, which could be something he needs to use to ignore his shortcomings, which he told us a lot about out loud. It seemed that Kaido had an unresolved issue that he desired so badly to be fixed, despite forcing the opposite. And that's where I think Shanks is ultimately different. And Roger was similar in this regard. In my opinion, Roger was strong because not only was he dead set in making it to his goal, but he also had a time limit pressuring him. Having the resolve to complete something no one else in the world has done while dying is no small feat. And I think Shanks has something similar. I think Shanks sees a future that he is trying to change, and because of how insanely hellish that future is, Shanks is ultimately resolved to sacrifice himself for it. In comparison, Kid is just some greedy little kid to him, and there's no way his resolve would ever match Shanks in this time frame. And that's where two lines stand out. First, in chapter 1079, Ben Beckman, Shanks' right hand, casually looks at Shanks saying he probably saw an ugly future. While Shanks is stressed, Ben is actually smiling, probably understanding that this is a reoccurring theme with Shanks. Shanks is fighting an ugly or hellish future. And the reason why that's important is because if I asked you who Shanks' enemy is, who would you say? I think that's an important question, because when you try to resolve against something, you should know who you're fighting. You should know your enemy. When I think of the previous antagonists, they are so small-sighted in comparison to Shanks. The ones that were scary had larger than life plans, but they didn't even know who they were fighting. Kaido was resolved against the world government. Doflamingo was a puppet master fighting the world, and maybe Doflamingo was the closest thing to Shanks, except Doflamingo didn't believe in a new era. So again, who is Shanks' enemy? I think Shanks' enemy is the future. Shanks sees an enemy that no one else sees and has been fighting the hardest thing, the literal future of the world. And Shanks actually told us that himself. In chapter 434, let me read part of this conversation that I'll be rereading many times in the next few videos. But Whitebeard says, "There aren't many who speak of the legend anymore. Your duel with Hawkeye is still fresh in my memory. Everyone was surprised beyond their imagination when you came back from East Blue missing an arm." And Whitebeard asks, "What enemy did you give that left arm to?" And Shanks responds, "This, I gave it up for the sake of the new era." And Whitebeard says, "As long as you don't have any regrets, that's fine." So in that moment, Shanks basically answered that his enemy is anything that prevents the new era, and he has no regrets doing that. And that makes sense. Every time Shanks steps in, it's to protect the new era, which means he is the one actively fighting against an enemy with 800 years of precedent and power. He is acting like a shield that comes in any time the new era is threatened. He isn't guiding it, he isn't pushing it, but he is standing out front. And most importantly, he has no regrets to sacrifice even his arm for it, to make a bet that wouldn't be fulfilled for another 14 years. To be able to do that, your willpower has to be next level. That is why Shanks is beyond every other character right now. There is no other character, not even Luffy, that has a resolve beyond personal desires to this extent. And beyond personal desires is arguably the most important thing. If Shanks can see all of these futures, I wonder what kind of future he sees for himself. Is it a positive one? Depending on that context, that could add to his resolve. And everything goes back to the first thing Rayleigh told us about haki. To never doubt, that is true power. Shanks is the character who made a bet 14 years ago on Luffy, and since then, he has been resolved. He has been unshaken and dominating. Every antagonist, even Luffy, has had doubt in the series, but Shanks is without a doubt the character that has been working towards a future and fighting against an enemy that no one else even sees. The man with true power willpower. This is the ceiling that Luffy has to overcome. Luffy has an unbreakable will, but it's been a will that has been developing over the series, growing. There is a reason why we call it a Haki bloom, right? The visual Luffy got when he discovered Advanced Conqueror's coding. It was flower petals. Shanks was waiting for Luffy to sprout and is going to show him the new ceiling for Luffy to grow towards and have himself replaced. A leader is one who sees more than others sees, who sees farther than others see, who sees before others see. And I think Shanks is that kind of a leader. I think just like Luffy showed us the next level of Devil Fruits with his Gear 5 awakening, Shanks will show us the next level with his Haki. And as Kaido said, Haki is everything. So I'm looking forward to see how the only Devil Fruitless Emperor has ruled the oceans with just Haki alone. And even more, why didn't he decide to conquer it like Roger did? And this conversation will continue in the coming videos. I will link all the reference videos and clips in the description below, but also I will be reworking a lot of these videos as I said I would the moment we get a glimpse of end stage characters demonstrating it. I feel like there's so much more I want to talk about, but I will when I get there. Thank you so much for all of your patience. If you enjoyed your time here, please leave a like and subscribe so that my channel can also have a Haki bloom and impress Shanks. I'm still mind blown of how much of those past theories already came into fruition just based off of Shanks. And the Elemental Haki video is the one I'm reworking with all of the details I had included throughout my entire channel because I truly think Elemental Haki will be the next horizon that Shanks and the other mystery characters of the last saga will demonstrate. And I almost wonder if there's even more of a parallel here. Rayleigh was the one who demonstrated the next horizon of One Piece with Haki and was also the teacher for Luffy to get him ready for that new world. I wonder if Shanks is going to not just be the new horizon, but the mentor for Luffy to get him ready for the last saga and bring us to a romance dawn. And so, like always, thank you for connecting with me, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all on the next ParVision.